The chill that seeped into Elias's bones had nothing to do with the damp concrete floor beneath him. It was the chill of absolute, irreversible commitment. Around him, hundreds of figures sat in silence, their faces obscured by the uniform gray jumpsuits they all wore. No names, no past, just numbers. Elias was 217. He'd signed away everything for this, for the faint, desperate hope of erasing a debt that had become a suffocating shroud. A voice, calm and unervingly polite, echoed from unseen speakers. "Welcome, participants, to the Lantern Trials. You are here because you have chosen to be. You are here because you seek a new beginning. And you are here because you understand the stakes." Elias swallowed, his throat dry. The air, thick with the scent of disinfectant and unspoken fear, seemed to press in on him. He glanced at the woman beside him, her shoulders hunched, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her number was 088. Across from them, a burly man with a shaved head, 301, stared straight ahead, his jaw set. "The rules are simple," the voice continued, devoid of inflection. "You will each be given a lantern. This lantern is your life. You will enter a series of underground tunnels, vast and labyrinthine. Your objective is to reach the exit. As long as your lantern's flame burns, you are alive. Should your flame extinguish for any reason, your participation in the trials will cease. Permanently." A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. The implication hung heavy, unspoken, yet brutally clear. If the flame dies, so do they. "There are no rules regarding interaction between participants," the voice added, a subtle shift in tone that sent a fresh wave of dread through Elias. "Cooperation is advised. However, your survival is your own responsibility. The path is long. The tunnels are dark. Good luck." The lights, which had been a harsh, sterile white, flickered once, then died, plunging the vast chamber into an oppressive, absolute blackness. A gasp, then murmurs of panic, quickly stifled. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a sudden, primal fear of the dark, a fear he hadn't known since childhood. This wasn't just darkness, it was a living, breathing void. Then a faint, rhythmic clinking sound. Footsteps approached, and a soft, golden glow began to appear, carried by figures in black, featureless uniforms. They moved silently, distributing the lanterns. Each one was a simple, old-fashioned oil lantern, heavy in Elias's trembling hand. The wick was already lit, casting a small, fragile circle of light around him. The flame, a tiny, dancing beacon, seemed impossibly vulnerable. He looked at his flame, then at the other participants, their faces now illuminated by the trembling light of their own lanterns. Fear, determination, madness, every emotion was etched onto their features. 088, the woman next to him, had tears silently tracking down her cheeks, reflecting the tiny flame. 301, the burly man, simply stared at his lantern, a grim resolve hardening his eyes. A heavy, metallic groan echoed through the chamber as a section of the wall began to slide open, revealing a gaping black maw. The entrance to the tunnels. A cold, damp draft swept in, making the lantern flames dance precariously. "Proceed," the voice commanded. One by one, the participants rose, their shadows stretching and shrinking grotesquely on the walls. They shuffled forward, a procession of flickering lights against an infinite darkness. Elias felt a strange mix of terror and morbid fascination. This was it. The Lantern Trials. A game of life and death, played in the suffocating embrace of the earth. He took a deep breath, the metallic tang of fear in his mouth, and stepped into the void. The tunnel swallowed him whole. The air inside was thick and cold, carrying the earthy scent of damp stone and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. Elias's lantern, held high, cast a wavering circle of light that barely pushed back the oppressive darkness. The walls were rough-hewn rock, glistening with moisture. The floor was uneven, sometimes slick with unseen puddles. He walked slowly, carefully, his eyes darting from his flame to the path ahead, then to the figures around him. The initial crowd had thinned quickly. The tunnel was wide enough for perhaps 5 or 6 people abreast, but the participants had spread out, some rushing ahead, others lagging behind, each a solitary island of light in a sea of black. The only sounds were the soft scrape of shoes, the drip of water, and the occasional unsettling echo of their own breathing. Suddenly a scream. Sharp, piercing, and abruptly cut short. Elias flinched, his lantern swaying. He spun around, but saw nothing but the receding lights of those behind him. The scream had come from somewhere ahead, or perhaps from a side passage he hadn't noticed. The implications were chilling. Had a flame died already? Oh. A woman near him, 142, stumbled, her lantern dipping dangerously close to a puddle. She gasped, righting it just in time, her face pale in the sudden flare of light. Elias felt a surge of empathy, quickly followed by a cold, selfish thought. One less competitor. He hated himself for it, but the thought was there, a dark seed planted by the trials. He continued, his senses heightened. Every rustle, every drip, every gust of air felt like a potential threat. The tunnels seemed to twist and turn without logic, occasionally opening into vast, echoing caverns, only to narrow again into claustrophobic passages where the walls pressed in on either side. He found himself walking alongside 088, the woman from the holding room. Her name, he learned, was Lena. She looked exhausted, her eyes wide and haunted. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Elias nodded. "Yeah. Doesn't sound like they're playing fair." "Fair?" Lena gave a brittle laugh. "They never said it would be fair. Just that the flame had to stay lit." She clutched her lantern tighter. "I just keep thinking about my son. He needs this." Elias didn't reply. He had no one waiting for him, no grand motivation beyond survival and the crushing weight of his own failures. That thought, however, spurred him on. He had to survive. He had to. The first true challenge came without warning. The tunnel ahead opened into a wide chasm, spanned by a series of narrow, rickety wooden planks. A gust of wind, unnaturally strong, howled up from the depths, making the lantern flames dance wildly. "Careful!" someone shouted. Elias watched as the first few participants attempted to cross. One man, his hands shaking, stepped onto a plank. The wind whipped around him and his flame flickered, then died with a faint pop. Before the light could even register the darkness, the man simply vanished. No scream, no fall, just gone. As if he had never been there. The horror of it was absolute. The voice had said, "Cease permanently," and it meant it. A wave of panic erupted. People hesitated, some turning back, only to find the passage behind them had sealed off, leaving no retreat. They were trapped. "We have to cross." 301, the burly man bellowed, his voice surprisingly steady. "One at a time. Hold your lanterns low, shield them." Elias watched him. 301, whose name was Cale, was a brute, but he had a strange, commanding presence. He stepped onto the first plank, moving with deliberate, heavy steps, his body hunched over his lantern, shielding it from the wind. He made it across. Lena went next, her face a mask of terror. Elias held his breath as she navigated the swaying planks, her small frame buffeted by the wind. She reached the other side, collapsing onto the stone, sobbing with relief. It was Elias's turn. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his hand. He remembered Cale's advice, hold it low, shield it. He stepped onto the plank. The wood groaned under his weight. The wind shrieked, tearing at his clothes, trying to snatch his flame. He pressed the lantern against his chest, his arm wrapped around it, his body a shield. Each step was an act of immense concentration, a battle against the elements and his own paralyzing fear. He felt the plank sway violently, heard the creak of rotting wood. His flame flickered, dancing on the edge of extinction. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second, then forced them open, focusing on the tiny, precious light. He stumbled onto solid ground, gasping for air, his muscles screaming. He had made it. He looked back. More people were crossing, some successfully, some not. The chilling sight of a lantern going out, followed by the instant disappearance of the person holding it, was becoming horrifyingly common. The tunnel ahead beckoned, darker, more menacing than before. The lantern trials had truly begun. The chasm crossing had culled a significant number of participants. The remaining group, now smaller and more wary, moved deeper into the labyrinth. The tunnels grew more complex, splitting into multiple paths, some leading to dead ends, others to new, terrifying challenges. The air grew colder, the dampness more pervasive, and the silence between the drips of water and the shuffle of feet became a heavy, suffocating presence. Elias found himself sticking close to Lena and Cale. Lena, despite her earlier tears, possessed a surprising resilience. She was observant, noticing subtle changes in the airflow or faint sounds that Elias and Cale missed. Cale, for his part, was a silent bulwark, his sheer physical presence a deterrent to any who might consider foul play, and his pragmatism a steadying force. "This isn't just about keeping the flame lit," Lena whispered one time, her voice hoarse from disuse. They were resting briefly in a small alcove, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows. "It's about everything else. The dark, the fear, each other." She was right. The psychological toll was immense. Paranoia was a constant companion. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat, every sound a trap. The fear of the flame dying was omnipresent, but so was the fear of another participant, driven to desperation, trying to extinguish your flame. They encountered their next major obstacle in a vast, echoing cavern. The floor was covered in a shallow, murky water, and from the ceiling large, jagged stalactites hung like monstrous teeth. A faint, almost imperceptible current flowed through the water, creating ripples that made the reflections of their lanterns dance like mad spirits. "Don't step in the deep parts," Kale warned, his voice low. "The current stronger there. Could knock your lantern." As if on cue, a man ahead of them, 045, misjudged a step. The water, deeper than it appeared, swirled around his ankles, then his knees. He stumbled, his lantern dipping below the surface. The flame hissed, then vanished. 045 froze for a split second, a look of pure, unadulterated terror on his face, before he too blinked out of existence. The ripples in the water were the only sign he had ever been there. "It's not just the water," Lena said, pointing to a section of the ceiling. "Look, those stalactites. They're dripping. And the drips are acidic." Elias squinted. Indeed, where the drops hit the water, tiny wisps of vapor rose, and the stone around them was pitted and discolored. A single drop, if it hit a flame directly, would surely extinguish it. "We need to find a path through the shallowest parts," Elias said, his mind racing. "And avoid the drips." The crossing was slow, agonizing. They moved like ghosts, their lanterns held high, their eyes scanning the water for deeper patches, the ceiling for dripping stalactites. The silence was broken only by the slosh of water and the occasional chilling plink of an acidic drop hitting the stone nearby. Halfway across, a sudden sharp crack echoed through the cavern. A section of the ceiling, weakened by the acid, gave way. A shower of small stones and a cascade of water, laced with acid, rained down. "Run!" Kale roared, pushing Lena and Elias forward. They scrambled, splashing through the water, their hearts pounding. Elias felt a searing sting on his arm as a drop of acid splashed him. He cried out but kept moving, shielding his lantern with his body. He saw another participant, a young woman, caught directly in the downpour. Her lantern sputtered, then died. She was gone. They made it to the other side, breathless and shaken. Elias examined his arm. A small, angry red burn was forming. Lena was coughing, her eyes watering from the fumes. Kale, remarkably, seemed unharmed, though his jumpsuit was stained and torn. "This isn't just a trial," Lena gasped, leaning against the cold stone wall. "It's a slaughter." "It's a game," Kale corrected, his voice grim. "And we're the players. The only way out is through." His words, brutal in their honesty, resonated with Elias. The trials weren't designed to be fair, or even survivable for most. They were designed to break them, to test the limits of their endurance, their sanity, and their humanity. And with each extinguished flame, the darkness seemed to grow a little more absolute, a little more hungry. Days blurred into an agonizing continuum of walking, fear, and the constant vigilance over their flickering flames. Elias, Lena, and Kale had formed an unspoken alliance, a fragile island of cooperation in a sea of escalating desperation. They shared what little food and water they found, small nutrient-dense bars and sterile pouches, left in seemingly random alcoves. But these were scarce, and hunger gnawed at their bellies, dulling their senses. The tunnels became a psychological gauntlet. Some passages were unnervingly silent, the air so still that the slightest movement of a lantern flame felt like a violent tremor. Others were filled with disorienting echoes, making it impossible to tell if a sound was a distant drip or the approach of another participant. The darkness beyond their lantern's glow seemed to press in, alive and malevolent. Elias started seeing things in the periphery of his vision, fleeting shadows, distorted faces, only for them to vanish when he turned his light directly on them. The trials themselves grew more insidious. They encountered a section where the floor was covered in a fine slippery dust that clung to everything, threatening to smother their wicks. They had to move with excruciating slowness, wiping their lanterns constantly. Another area was a maze of narrow, winding passages where sudden, powerful drafts would blast through, forcing them to huddle together, shielding their flames with their bodies, praying the gust would pass. One such draft caught a group ahead of them. Elias watched in horror as 3 lanterns, one after another, winked out. The accompanying disappearances were no longer shocking, but a grim, accepted reality. Each time, a part of Elias died too, a small piece of his humanity chipped away by the relentless brutality. The most terrifying challenge yet came in a vast circular chamber. In the center stood a single massive stone pillar, and from its base dozens of thin, almost invisible wires radiated outwards, stretching to the walls. As they approached, they saw the glint of metal. These weren't just wires. They were tripwires, and attached to them were small, almost invisible bells. "Look," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. "The air. It's moving. There's a constant, gentle current in here. If you touch a wire, the bell rings and the draft will intensify. It'll be strong enough to put out a flame." Cale cursed under his breath. "A silent killer. You don't even see it coming." They watched as a participant, a young man who had been rushing ahead, brushed against a wire. A tiny, almost inaudible tinkle sounded. For a split second nothing happened. Then a sudden violent gust of wind erupted from unseen vents in the ceiling, directly over the man. His lantern flame danced frantically, then vanished. He was gone. The remaining participants froze. This was a test of absolute precision, of unwavering focus. "We go slow," Cale said, his voice firm. "One foot in front of the other. Keep your eyes on the wires. Don't rush." Elias felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. This was worse than the chasm, worse than the acid. This was a test of nerves, a slow, agonizing crawl through an invisible web of death. He watched Cale go first. The big man, despite his size, moved with surprising grace, his eyes fixed on the floor, on the faint glint of the wires. He moved his feet with agonizing slowness, lifting them high, placing them down with painstaking care. He made it halfway across. Then a sudden sharp sound from behind them. A participant, driven by panic or exhaustion, had tried to rush. A cacophony of bells erupted, and a furious gale swept through the chamber. Elias instinctively dropped to one knee, shielding his lantern with his entire body, pressing it against the cold stone floor. He heard screams, the frantic flapping of clothing, and then silence. When the wind died down, he looked up. More lights were gone. The chamber was even emptier. Cale had survived, his body pressed against the pillar. Lena, too, was huddled, her lantern still lit. "This is madness," Lena sobbed, her voice cracking. "They want us to kill each other, don't they? To break down." Elias didn't answer. He just stared at the remaining wires, the invisible threads of death stretching out before them. He knew with a chilling certainty that the trials weren't just about survival, they were about transformation. They were stripping away everything that made them human, leaving only the primal instinct to survive, no matter the cost. And the cost, he realized, was becoming terrifyingly clear. The wire chamber had taken its toll, both in numbers and in spirit. The remaining participants were fewer, and the unspoken pacts of cooperation had frayed. Distrust festered like a wound. Elias, Lena, and Cale still clung together, but even their bond felt stretched thin, tested by the relentless pressure. They stumbled into a new section of the tunnels, one unlike any they had seen before. The walls here were not rough stone, but smooth, polished black obsidian, reflecting their lantern flames in distorted, unsettling ways. The air was unnaturally still, heavy with an almost metallic scent. And the silence was absolute, broken only by the soft pad of their own footsteps. Then they saw them. Figures. Standing motionless in alcoves carved into the obsidian walls. Not living people, but mannequins, dressed in the same gray jumpsuits, each holding an extinguished lantern. Their faces, though expressionless, seemed to mock the living. And then Elias noticed something else. The mannequins were arranged in a sequence, leading deeper into the tunnel. And on the chest of each mannequin, a number was subtly carved. "Look," Lena whispered, pointing. "They're counting down." Elias followed her gaze. The first mannequin was 001, the next 002, and so on. A chilling realization dawned on him. These weren't just mannequins. These were the participants who had failed, their final moments somehow captured and displayed as a morbid exhibition. A macabre gallery of the dead. As they moved deeper, the numbers on the mannequins grew higher, until they reached figures Elias recognized. 045, the man lost in the water cavern. 142, the woman who had stumbled near the puddle. And then a sickening lurch in his stomach. He saw a mannequin with the number 088. Lena gasped, a strangled sound. She stumbled back, her eyes wide with horror, staring at the lifeless figure that wore her number. "No," she whimpered. "No, that's not me." Cale grabbed her arm, pulling her away. "It's a trick, Lena. They're trying to mess with our heads." But Lena was inconsolable, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She clutched her own lantern, staring at the mannequin as if it were her own ghost. The psychological impact was devastating. The fear of death was one thing. Seeing your own death, your own failure laid out before you was another entirely. As they tried to pull Lena away, a sudden, piercing shriek echoed through the obsidian tunnel. It wasn't human. It was a high-pitched metallic screech that seemed to vibrate through their very bones, making their teeth ache. The sound was deafening, disorienting. Elias instinctively clapped his hands over his ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate him. His lantern flame danced wildly, threatening to extinguish. Lena, already on the brink, screamed. Her hands flew to her head, and in her terror, her grip on the lantern loosened. It slipped from her fingers, clattering to the polished floor. The glass chimney shattered, and the flame, exposed, flickered once, then died. The metallic shriek abruptly ceased. Lena froze, her scream dying in her throat. She looked at her extinguished lantern, then slowly, with a look of utter despair, she turned to Elias. Her eyes, wide and filled with a profound sadness, met his. "My son," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then she was gone. Just like the others. No sound, no trace. Only the shattered remains of her lantern on the obsidian floor, reflecting the light of Elias's and Cale's flames. Elias stood frozen, staring at the empty space where Lena had been. The horror was overwhelming. He had seen so many disappearances, but this was different. This was Lena. He had walked with her, talked with her, shared the terror with her. And now she was gone, a victim not of a physical trap, but of a psychological one. Cale stood beside him, his face grim, his eyes fixed on the shattered lantern. There was no anger, no panic, just a deep, weary resignation. "They knew," he muttered, his voice rough. "They knew what would break her." A cold, hard knot formed in Elias's stomach. The voice had said, no rules regarding interaction between participants. But it had never said anything about the overseers playing fair. This was a deliberate act of psychological torture, designed to push them to the breaking point, to make them self-destruct. The realization hardened something inside Elias. The lantern trials were not just a game, they were a cruel, elaborate experiment in human endurance and despair. And he was still in it. He was still alive. And he would not let Lena's death be in vain. He would not break. He would survive. Even if it meant walking through hell itself with only a flickering flame to guide him. The journey continued, now with only two lights in the vast, echoing darkness. Elias and Cale moved in a grim, determined silence. Lena's disappearance had solidified their resolve, yet also cast a pall of profound loneliness over them. The tunnels seemed to stretch endlessly, each turn revealing another corridor identical to the last, a monotonous progression designed to erode their sanity. They passed more mannequin displays, each one a chilling reminder of those who had fallen. Elias tried not to look, but the numbers, the familiar gray jumpsuits, haunted his periphery. He wondered if his own number, 217, would soon join the macabre exhibition. Food and water became even scarcer. Their bodies ached, their minds were dulled by exhaustion, and their voices were hoarse from disuse. The only sound was the rhythmic shuffle of their feet and the occasional unsettling drip of water. The air grew colder and a faint, metallic smell like ozone began to permeate the tunnels. They entered a section where the floor sloped downwards, gently at first, then more steeply. The air grew heavy, and the sound of rushing water became audible, growing louder with every step. Elias's heart pounded. He remembered the water cavern, the acidic drips. What fresh hell awaited them now? The tunnel opened into a massive, subterranean river. The water, black and churning, flowed with incredible speed, disappearing into a gaping maw further down the cavern. There was no bridge, no planks, just the roaring current and the sheer, slick rock walls. "How do we cross this?" Elias yelled over the din, his voice swallowed by the roar. Cale pointed. On the far side of the river, a faint, pulsing light was visible. It was the exit. The final goal. But between them and it lay the raging torrent. "There!" Cale shouted, pointing to a series of narrow, almost invisible ledges carved into the cliff face above the river. "We have to climb. Above the water." Elias looked up. The ledges were barely wide enough for a foot, and the rock was slick with spray from the river. One slip, one moment of dizziness and it was over. And the wind, generated by the rushing water, was fierce, making their lantern flames dance wildly. Cale went first, his massive frame surprisingly agile. He moved slowly, testing each foothold, his body pressed against the cold rock. He held his lantern in his teeth, its light bobbing precariously, illuminating the treacherous path. Elias watched, his breath caught in his throat. Cale was halfway across when a sudden violent gust of wind, stronger than any they had yet encountered, roared through the cavern. Kale's lantern flame flickered, then dimmed. Elias cried out, but Kale, with a desperate, guttural roar, pressed his face into the rock, shielding the lantern with his head and shoulders. The flame, against all odds, sputtered back to life, though it was smaller, weaker. He reached the other side, collapsing onto a wider ledge, gasping for air, his body trembling. "Your turn, Elias," he shouted. "Be careful. The wind is unpredictable." Elias took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He looked at his lantern, its flame a fragile beacon against the overwhelming darkness. This was it. The final trial. He had to make it. For Lena. For himself. He began to climb. Each movement was deliberate, agonizing. His fingers scrabbled for purchase on the slick rock, his feet searched for the narrow ledges. The roar of the river was deafening, a constant reminder of the abyss below. The wind tore at him, trying to pry his lantern from his grasp. He held it tight, pressing it against his chest, his body a shield, just as Kale had done. He felt a sudden sharp pain in his hand. A jagged piece of rock had cut him. Blood welled up, warm and sticky, but he ignored it. He couldn't afford to lose focus. He was almost there. Just a few more feet. Then a sickening lurch. The ledge beneath his foot crumbled. He cried out, his body pitching outwards over the roaring river. His lantern swung wildly, its flame flickering, threatening to go out. Terror, cold and absolute, seized him. He scrabbled desperately for a handhold, his fingers scraping against the smooth rock. He found a tiny crevice, digging his fingertips into it, his muscles screaming with the effort. He pulled himself back, his heart hammering against his ribs. His lantern, miraculously, was still lit, though the flame was a tiny, desperate spark. He hauled himself onto the wider ledge next to Kale, collapsing, breathless and shaking. Kale clapped him on the shoulder, a rare, genuine smile on his grim face. "You made it, kid. You made it." They stood there for a moment, two survivors, their lanterns casting a small, defiant glow in the face of the overwhelming darkness. The exit, a faint, pulsing light, seemed closer now, a promise of freedom. But something felt wrong. The air, though still heavy, had a strange, almost artificial quality to it. And the light ahead, it wasn't the pure, clean light of the outside world. It was a sickly, unnatural glow. The lantern trials weren't over yet. The true horror Elias suspected was still to come. The pulsing light at the end of the tunnel beckoned, a beacon of hope and dread. As Elias and Kale approached, the metallic ozone scent grew stronger, almost acrid. The tunnel widened into a vast, circular chamber, bathed in the same sickly greenish-blue light that emanated from a massive central structure. This structure was unlike anything they had seen. It was a towering, cylindrical column of polished black material, pulsating with faint internal light. Around its base, hundreds of wires, thin and almost invisible, snaked across the floor, disappearing into the walls. And on the walls, illuminated by the eerie glow, were more mannequins. Thousands of them. Each one holding an extinguished lantern, each one bearing a number. The gallery of the dead stretched endlessly, a horrifying testament to the sheer scale of the trials. In the center of the chamber, directly in front of the pulsating column, stood a lone figure. Dressed in the same black uniform as the distributors of the lanterns, but taller, more imposing. This figure wore no mask, but their face was obscured by a hood, leaving only a shadow. "Welcome, survivors," a new voice echoed through the chamber. This voice was deeper, richer than the previous one, and carried an unsettling resonance. "You have reached the culmination of the lantern trials. You are the last." Elias and Kale exchanged a glance. The last. Out of hundreds. The realization was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. "You have proven your resilience, your determination, your will to survive," the voice continued. "But the trials are not merely about survival. They are about understanding. About the true nature of humanity." The hooded figure raised a hand, and a section of the central column began to glow brighter, revealing intricate mechanisms within. It was a colossal, complex machine humming with unseen energy. "Your lanterns," the voice explained, "are not merely vessels for oil and wick. They are connected. Each flame a unique signature. When a flame extinguishes, the energy, the very essence of that life, is harvested. Absorbed into this core." Elias felt a cold dread crawl up his spine. Harvested? The energy of life? And for what purpose? Kale demanded, his voice raw. The hooded figure turned slowly towards them. For the ultimate creation. The perfect light. As the figure spoke, the central column pulsed violently, and a blinding white light erupted from its core, momentarily overwhelming their lanterns. Elias shielded his eyes, blinking away the spots. When his vision cleared, he saw it. From the top of the column, a single, enormous flame now burned. It was not the soft, golden glow of their lanterns, but a brilliant, pure white fire, radiating an intense heat that made the air shimmer. It was perfect, unwavering, eternal. This, the voice boomed, now filled with a chilling pride, is the culmination, the distilled essence of all who have fallen. The perfect light, born from 1,000 extinguished hopes. Elias stared at the monstrous flame, his mind reeling. All those lives. All that fear, that desperation, that pain. It had all been funneled into this unholy, artificial sun. And what about us? Elias asked, his voice trembling. What happens to the survivors? The hooded figure gestured to a small, narrow opening in the wall, previously unseen. The exit. You are free to leave. And you will receive your promised reward. A life of comfort, of freedom from debt, from want. A life illuminated by the sacrifices of others. Elias looked at the exit, then back at the colossal flame. He thought of Lena, of her tears, of her last whispered word, son. He thought of all the nameless faces, all the desperate souls who had vanished into the darkness. Their suffering had fueled this abomination. No, Elias whispered, a sudden fierce anger burning within him. No, this isn't freedom. This is monstrous. Cale, standing beside him, remained silent, his eyes fixed on the perfect flame, a strange mix of awe and horror on his face. The promise of wealth, of an end to their suffering, was a powerful lure. You have a choice, participant 217, the voice said, its tone hardening. Accept your reward and walk into the light. Or reject it and remain in the darkness. Elias looked at his own lantern, its small, flickering flame suddenly feeling insignificant, yet infinitely precious. It was a flame born of oil and wick, yes, but also of his own will, his own struggle, his own humanity. It was imperfect, vulnerable, but it was his. And it was real. Unlike the cold, sterile perfection of the manufactured light. He thought of the debt, of the life he could have. He thought of the endless, suffocating darkness of the tunnels. But then he thought of the screams, the disappearances, the shattered hope. He couldn't accept a reward built on such a foundation. I won't, Elias said, his voice gaining strength. I won't be a part of this. The hooded figure tilted its head slightly. A curious choice. You would condemn yourself to perpetual darkness then? Elias took a step forward, raising his lantern. This darkness, he said, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction, is better than your false light. He looked at Cale. The big man met his gaze, and Elias saw a flicker of understanding, perhaps even admiration in his eyes. Cale had seen the same horrors, endured the same trials. He knew the price. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, Elias swung his lantern. The glass chimney shattered against the black obsidian column, and the flame, exposed to the air, danced wildly for a moment, then sputtered. The perfect flame atop the central column pulsed violently as if in protest. The air crackled with energy. Elias watched his own flame, his heart pounding, but not with fear. With defiance. He had chosen. He had chosen humanity, even in the face of oblivion. The flame flickered, struggled, and then with a final, defiant gasp, it died. The world went black. But Elias did not disappear. He stood there in the absolute, crushing darkness, a profound silence enveloping him. He could still feel the cold stone beneath his feet, the damp air on his skin. He could still hear the faint hum of the machine, the distant roar of the river. He was still there. A chilling thought pierced the darkness. They had lied. The voice, now devoid of all pretense of politeness, echoed through the void, cold and clinical. Participant 217. An anomaly. The system registers a rejection. A failure to integrate. Fascinating. Elias felt a surge of terror, colder than any he had experienced. He hadn't vanished. He was still here. But what did that mean? What was worse than vanishing? The lantern trials are not merely a test of survival, the voice continued, closer now, seeming to emanate from all around him. They are a process of refinement. Of extracting the most valuable resource, the will. The will to live, the will to sacrifice, the will to yield. And when that will is extinguished, it fuels our purpose. Elias tried to move, to run, but the darkness was a physical weight, pressing him down. He was blind, disoriented. You, participant 217, possess a unique will. A will to defy. A will to reject. That, too, is a powerful energy. And it will be put to good use. He heard a faint whirring sound growing louder, closer. He felt a cold metallic touch on his arm, then his leg. Restraints. He struggled, but he was weak, exhausted and blind. Your flame may have died, participant 217, the voice concluded, a note of chilling satisfaction in its tone. But your light, your unique defiance, will burn forever. Within the core. A perpetual anomaly. A new kind of fuel. Elias felt a sharp, searing pain as something pierced his skin. He screamed, a raw, desperate sound swallowed by the overwhelming darkness. He was being pulled, dragged towards the humming, pulsating core. He was not gone. He was not free. He was simply integrated. His defiance, his rejection, his very essence, was now part of the monstrous machine, feeding the perfect, unholy flame. The last thing he heard before the darkness consumed him entirely was the faint, rhythmic hum of the machine, a lullaby of eternal torment. The lantern trials had claimed him, not in death, but in a fate far more terrifying. He was a ghost in the machine, a flicker of consciousness trapped forever in the heart of the perfect light, a silent scream in the eternal darkness. The trials never ended. They simply changed the nature of the participant. And Elias, the defiant 217, had become their newest, most valuable and most horrifying fuel.